Around Thanksgiving, people more and more are anxiously awaiting those gatherings with their families. And there's often a meme that goes around of some kind about how to manage Thanksgiving together in these divided times. And often some of the advice is, if you want your Thanksgiving dinner to go well, don't talk about politics or religion. Well, maybe at one of our dinner parties, we would at least talk about religion, and I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to talk about religion. So I'm going to talk about religion a little, but I'm not going to miss this opportunity to talk about politics a little too, because the gospel gives me permission to do that. And this question of the intersection of politics and religion does come up, doesn't it? Now, I'm not asking because I want to zero in on a particular case, but to say, where does this idea come from that our politics and our faith do not come together? Look at the matters before us right now, just a few of them. For example, are policy outcomes, that is politics, or moral implications, that is religion, more important when considering the abortion question? That's an intersectional question. What are the moral limits of our First Amendment? Is there ever such a thing as a just war? These are questions that bring these two together. Sometimes we have to choose. Sometimes we have to compromise. But we have to look at them together. When we are trying to live faithfully on matters of politics, we can be so pulled by our experience, our life experience, our biases, what we've been told, what we saw on the internet, for better or for worse, our fears and our conscience. We are pulled often from multiple directions. Sometimes we can find ourselves kind of joining in on both sides because we're trying to be empathetic. We are challenged ultimately to hold our faith and politics together, and sometimes that means they're in tension with each other. So I'm happy that the gospel has come to us today, because in this text we have a quite simple question laid out by the Pharisees. Jesus, they say, which is it, God or Caesar? And it strikes me that this is exactly the kind of question God sent Jesus into the world to help us with. It is a question of what it means to be both image bearers of God, touched by the divine on the one hand, but then, a highly evolved mammal on the other, with an amygdala. And we live in a beautiful but messy world. For God so loved the world, that John wrote, that God came into it as one of us. Presumably, Jesus had an amygdala. Get your mind around that. The Son of God was born of a Jesus mother, raised by an earthly father, Joseph. He was subject to all earthly forces: gravity, aging, hunger, exhaustion, pain, mortality, and he was subject also to earthly rulers, including Caesar, who had taken Judea as a Roman province and made Pilate its prefect. And as a Jew, Jesus was also subject to Herod, the king of the Jews, the king of Judea. He was a puppet of Rome. And his parents raised him and educated him according to all the dictates of Jewish tradition. He was subject to Jewish law as set down by the Torah, as interpreted by priests and rabbis, and adjudicated by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish courts. Jesus was born and raised in this world, just as we are. And Jesus was called Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus knew something about the struggle to live faithfully in accordance with God, while being squeezed almost to the breaking point by a repressive pagan empire. The times were so stressful in Jesus' time for these communities that most of them, including the communities in Thessalonica, were convinced the end times were near. Sometimes it feels like that, doesn't it? And Jesus observed that Jews were absolutely not aligned on how to negotiate their way through, which also sounds familiar, not just about the Jews, about all of us. Some of the Jews in that time, the Essenes, for example, felt the only way was to head for the hills, to get out of Jerusalem because it was just too infested by Hellenistic compromise, and it was the purity of the temple had been utterly desecrated. Others, like Simon the Zealot, advocated violent revolt against Rome. Then we have the Pharisees, pious and traditional. They believed that their collective safety depended on resisting the Hellenistic influence and adhering more strictly to Jewish law. They worried that Jesus was leading his followers astray, this man who would teach on the Sabbath and would speak from the human tradition, that is oral law, and not just the Torah. Then there were the aristocratic priests who supervised the temple and the Sanhedrin. Most of these were Sadducees. They were privileged. They considered themselves guardians of the traditions. They existed at the pleasure of the Romans, and the Romans left them alone as long as they were not a threat to the peace. They worried about Jesus. They worried whether this rabble-rouser would call attention to the Jewish communities. Would Jesus bring them down with him? And in this concern, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees were beginning to come together, fearing a breakdown in the stability of their community. They colluded to keep the Romans off their back. So here we have the Pharisees who are probing. They are, it's like deposition, of Jesus to gather evidence that they can take before a grand jury, evidence that Jesus is indeed a threat. And so they ask him, should we obey God or Caesar? And they're asking it as a loyalty test. And Jesus knows exactly what they're asking and why they are asking it. They have given him an either-or question, and he will not be taken in. His answer is to expose their false equivalency. And here, Jesus is not trying, to be the smartest lawyer in the room. He is calling the Pharisees hypocrites because the question is not useful. It is not helpful for his people. So he is calling the Pharisees out of their hypothetical place into the real world in which they live and struggle. A world where God is working, yes, and in which there are earthly rulers to whom the people are subjects. Amidst the competing Judaism of Jesus' time, his was a different voice. Nowhere in the gospel does he promote violence, as the Zealots did. Nowhere does he promote withdrawing from the world, as the Essenes did. Nowhere does he disavow Jewish law. Nowhere does he advocate withholding taxes. And there were a lot of taxes. There were Roman taxes on crops, a head tax on every female of over 12 and every male over 14. There were road taxes, port fees, taxes that supported Roman temples. There were a lot of taxes. And all of them came by way of obeisance to Caesar as emperor. Then there were offerings required him as a Jew, tithes of produce, whether crops or flocks, first fruits offerings to be brought to the temple during pilgrimage, along with a sin offering, a temple tax upon every adult Jewish male. Those are just some of the offerings expected. Now, as far as we know, Jesus paid all these taxes, and he advised others to do so. And as far as his religious obligations, they came with being Jewish. The required Jewish offerings made possible the economy and institutions of Judean community life, the rituals of Jewish culture and identity, provision for the tangible support of loving neighbors, the courts of justice and preservation of the faith, and yes, the preservation of the temple, the center of Jewish religious life, the spiritual source, and the very dwelling place of the one God. Jesus understood these offerings as the duty and the ethical core of being in covenant with the God of Israel. But he also spoke the truth often when the Jewish establishment failed to align their institutions with the greatest commandments, to be centered first in the love of God and the love of neighbor. The same temple in which he overturned tables was supported by his temple tax. Yet he was always seeking to transform. Sometimes we too are called to work for change from within. In fact, because Jesus' earthly ministry was largely focused on the Jewish community, his response on the question of the emperor's tax was pragmatic. There was no purchase in even small acts of rebellion against Caesar. It was not the attention he sought, nor the message he wanted to send. He had no point to make to Caesar. It was not God's will for him to take on Caesar. Indeed, Jesus died at the hands of Romans, rather to hold to God in spite of him. He was here for the lost sheep, and he stayed focused. He taught his followers to decrease Caesar's hold on them by increasing God through their life together. And their suffering was just beginning. The cross was yet to come, but Jesus' way of love grew despite the oppression and expulsions and persecutions. Almost every time Jesus was invited into snap judgments or polarizing questions, he refused to be drawn into them. In the real world, then and now, so polarized and divided, it's hard to take a breath and remember that the people we consider enemies are beloved of God. That our Twitter banter is not a tennis match, that politics are not a spectacle, although, well, they are a spectacle, but they're not supposed to be a spectacle. It's so easy to be distracted and drawn to an extreme edge. Yet whether we are deliberating an issue or an action, there is no true productive ground but the middle. Indeed, arrows may come from both sides, and it is never where perfection is. The middle never makes everybody happy. But sometimes we are the ones who need to come there and meet people. Sometimes others need to come towards us. That's where the possibility is. That's where humanity can be. So it takes strength to be faithful in the world. It takes courage to act. It takes commitment not to retreat. We have to listen. We have to be willing to change our mind. And that's really why we are called to be a church. That's why Jesus started with 12 and built from there. We are members of this body. We are in it together. And so we pray, we encourage, we share each other's sorrows and joys. We listen to each other's stories. We laugh and we cry. We learn. We make mistakes. We forgive, and we are forgiven. But above all, we give thanks. Giving thanks is our way of increasing God and decreasing the powers of this world. We give thanks to God for the incarnation of God as Jesus, the greatest of all mysteries. This is first and foremost a gift of extravagant grace and generosity. I mean, just theologically, if you think about the distance that God traveled between Godness and us, it's a vast chasm. And yet Jesus came and met us on the dust from which we come. And so in his knowing of us, just as we are, wherever we are, we know we are loved in our giftedness, in our power, and in our limitations and our weakness. We are called to responsibility in the world, and we have the challenge of resisting the toxic politics of the world. But we cannot not engage. And we cannot do that without God's help. The good news is we are called only to do the very best we can. For that, we give God thanks, and may Jesus examine